You're currently the CEO of Multicultural Australia. That's a huge responsibility. What key contributors have led you to where you are today?
Certainly, I had a very long journey in the Queensland government, and I loved every moment of working in government. I was very fortunate that I was able to work in areas. So, going into high school, midway through high school, is a very challenging thing to do when you're learning a new culture, a new country.
That's empowerment. That's true empowerment. There are many stories out there of strength, resilience, and courage, and we're on a mission to bring all of them to you. Welcome to Empowered Voices Amplified, a podcast brought to you by Skilled Migrant Professional magazine. Our guest today is Christine Castley, who most of you would know. Obviously, she is the CEO of Multicultural Australia. Welcome to the show, Christine.
Thank you so much. It's really lovely to be here.
Well, we're really excited to have this conversation with you. And, you're currently the CEO of Multicultural Australia. That's a huge responsibility. What key contributors have led you to where you are today?
I'm going to maybe surprise you by kind of saying chance because, often people will talk about, the many kind of planned pieces of their journey, their career journey that led them to where they had landed. But for me, my career has been very much characterized by me just seeing an opportunity and going, maybe I'll give it a go and just go grab that. So certainly I had a very long journey in the Queensland government, and I loved every moment of working in government. I was very fortunate that I was able to work in areas where I felt the work I was doing had real impact: domestic and family violence, criminal justice, a whole range of issues, housing, those sorts of things. And it was just happenstance that someone said to me, oh, there's this role going in the non-government organisation community services sector. Why don't you have a go? And I thought, I'll apply for it just for a bit of practice, just to see what interview processes are like in the community services sector. And then it just moved really quickly and I landed in this role. But having said it was by chance, once I landed in the role and started to talk to the people who were within the organisation in the communities that we worked with, it really felt like every path I had followed on my career journey had led to this moment, including my personal journey as a migrant coming here to Australia at the age of 15. So, going into high school, midway through high school is a very challenging thing to do when you're learning a new culture, a new country. And then kind of even just all of the different parts that I'd done in government in different human services spaces, which allowed me to see that broader piece outside of the multicultural community, which allowed me to learn things that were really, really useful when I came back to then this more specific area that kind of was very connected to my own personal lived experience, meant that it really magnified the sense that I was here to make a difference. And that's what got me to where I am today and what guides me every day kind of going forward in this role, which I do love very much.
I love that you saw a chance and you took it. That's
Yeah.
empowerment. That's true empowerment. You said you moved to Australia when you were 15. That's a very interesting age because a lot is going on at that age. How did you find the transition into Australia and the school system?
Yeah, it was very interesting. And, I often say to people, you lose your accent very quickly because when you're 15, you just want to blend in. You want to be like everybody else, right? So, and I think that really laid the settings for me too. I always say every migrant is almost like a chameleon because you are hyper aware of your settings and how you adjust and adapt, but also make your deliberate decisions about how you want to look in the environment that you want to be in. And school is absolutely a place where you need to think about your environment. So it was interesting, those first initial pieces when, even just catching public transport was a challenge because it was quite different in terms of what you did. Walking through school, I always like to say, on the first day I had a buddy who said to me, all right, so, swimming carnival's on tomorrow, make sure you bring your togs and we're going to go in the classroom, toss your port up on the port rack. And I went, what language is this person speaking? I speak English. I had a very strong accent, but I didn't understand many of those words. So it is local slang, but even just understanding things like that very first day. So I come from Malaysia, where when a teacher walks into a classroom in Malaysia, the whole class stands up and says and greets the teacher. So when a teacher walked into the classroom, I stood up, and no one else in the classroom paid much attention until the teacher called to order. So just those little protocols and things that also then I think all contribute to that hyper awareness that I spoke about, that you kind of go, hang on, I am in a world where the ways of doing things are very different. I have to think about every move I make if I don't want to embarrass myself, because that's so important to a 15-year-old. And then I think out of that process, you learn resilience, because you learn to kind of brush off those incidents that, do kind of, make you feel different, where people laugh at you. And there are always incidents of racism and bullying that you learn to deal with. You learn to navigate through. You learn not to call out every single thing that is done to you, because you've got to think about it is going to kind of be worth your while, rather than being seen as the person who's always kind of carrying on in a negative sense. So you learn to kind of emphasize the positive narratives as well of where you are. All of this, I think, is not unique to me individually. It is, but I think it's quite common to the situation of any person who comes into a new country or culture as a migrant, which actually builds this really kind of amazing, I call it a superpower, chameleon superpower, I think is what I'm going to call it, which is about learning to adapt and be safe in an environment so that you can actually realize your full potential.
That is a lot of mental power. A lot
Yeah.
of mental a lot of mental power. Well, multiculturalism is such a big topic and covers so many groups of people. Can you walk us through the key focus of Multicultural Australia and how it's contributing to building better communities in Australia?
Yeah, so Multicultural Australia's been around we celebrated 25 years of being around last year. So it's been around for a few years now, just over a quarter of a century. And over that time, I'm going to kind of raise the really boring thing of a strategic plan, but Multicultural Australia has some really cool strategic pillars which has kind of evolved, and they are belonging, changing the conversation, and being fit for the future. And they're very bit they've been carefully thought through, and and kind of a lot of conversations around what does this mean. So our first pillar about creating belonging is a really important part, about saying, how do you create welcome, how do you create value, how do you make people safe, what does belonging mean? And one of the most powerful things, conversations I heard around the belonging piece, was when we were having a conversation, and someone said, is that about connection and inclusion? And we had a client who kind of says, well, no, because connection is when you connect me up, you introduce me to people. Inclusion is when you make sure I get invited to things or included in things. But belonging, I need to really feel in my heart that I belong in this place. And we need to think about what happens for me to be able to feel in my heart that I belong in the place that I'm in. And that's when it comes down to, how do you create those memories that gives a person a connection to the land, gives them a connection to the people around them. And that is something that can happen over time, but it is about kind of creating very special moments that matter, that influence your perception of yourself and also the trajectory of your life. So belonging is a really important part of the work that we do. And then changing the conversation, which is about saying, let's challenge the way we talk about things. Because the way we talk about things, the words that we use in our conversations really make a difference for how we see the world and how others see us. So we find ways to change the conversation in community and within communities as well. So we often say, the broader Australian community needs to understand all of the different cultures that actually now live here. But all of those different cultures, if you come as a new arrival, you equally need to understand the broader Australian community culture, and you need to understand the cultures of others and weave that all into your engagement and your interactions. Now, all of that is about conversations, the conversations we have, spoken and unspoken, and how do we change the ways we approach those conversations to actually then bring us together to be a stronger, more community that still celebrates our difference, but has worked out the way to kind of reap the benefits of the strength of our diversity, but also to allow the space for all of the challenges of our diversity. So that's a change in the conversation piece. And that leads into that fit for the future bit, which is about for us to be ready for the future and for a future that's great, then we need to actually think about our own capability, about where do we need to expend our energy and our effort, what should we be planning for, what should we be thinking is over the horizon, and how do we learn from our history in terms of shaping our position for the future. So that sets the scene then for how we do our work at Multicultural Australia. What are our programs doing to create belonging, but also to change the conversation? How do we advocate in community in the ways that we do our work, in the things that we design, how we engage with people, and how we ensuring that everyone is best placed for the future? And in working with individuals and communities to do that is a really important part in terms of keeping the work that we do, keeping it real. The community is a very big place. And you're coming to your question about how do you make sure no one is left behind is a really hard question because you kind of got to go, sometimes you got to go looking for people. Sometimes people don't want to be found. And so you got to be really empathetic. You've got to walk in the shoes of others to kind of just say, I want to make sure everyone's coming along for the ride. Well, maybe not everyone wants to come along for the ride, but just because they don't want to come along for the ride right now doesn't mean they might not want to in the future. So again, it is about keeping that really active lens, looking out for others, allowing them to be in their spaces, hoping they'll come along when you want everyone to come along, but understanding if they don't. But keeping an eye out and not saying things like, well, we invited you along once, you didn't come, clearly you don't want to play with us. We don't play, do a check-in every so often. So all of that, again, involves, I think, just being really empathetic and thinking about connections all the time, all coming at that from a place of compassion, respect, and understanding that each individual has their worth and each individual has their own space and time in which they want to do things.
Well, I have to say, I absolutely love your work. I follow your journey very closely on LinkedIn. And I see all the wonderful things you're doing. It's absolutely amazing. And this leads me to my next question around a fair go. So I hear this a lot from
Mm.
politicians, from people in power, and they talk a lot about everyone has a fair go in Australia. With the work that you're doing and with your experience, do you believe everyone in Australia does get a fair go despite their race or gender?
Short answer, no. um, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't keep talking about a fair
Mm,
go as something that we should be working towards. And also recognizing Australia, like every other country, is a country of contradictions, right? It
yeah.
talks about the fair go, but it started as a country where a group of convicts were brought here, where a group of First Nations people were displaced, where some people got a better go at things than compared to
Mm,
others. And it was a very hierarchical and very structured environment in that sense. And some of those, deficiencies, if you like, in terms of people getting a fair go, kind of continue to be embedded in where we are structurally. I think we have to be really careful when we talk about this notion about absolutely everyone should have a fair go.
mm,
And sometimes I think probably the best way to frame it, I think, is that if Australia is a country of a fair go, what does that mean? Then one way to frame it is that to say we're a country where every person feels that as a country we've got your back. Regardless of
mm,
who you are, where you come from, what you want to do, we will have your back. We will find a way to give you a safety net and also to give you a platform or a trampoline from which you can kind of bounce forward to go the way
mm,
you want to go. That's, I think, how we should frame a goal around being a country of a fair go. And so if you think about it that way, then it's not about a one size fits all solution to tackling it. There are some things that we need to absolutely address, and we need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable in talking about these things. Let's be honest about
mm,
talking about racism
yeah.
and systemic discrimination and how people put labels on others that actually then mean that they then exclude them, because that is a reality. Australia is not unique in being a country where all of this exists. Any community, any society has racism. Doesn't mean it's right, but it's a reality. And let's talk about it. Let's work out ways to think about how we call it out. Let's think about not just leaving it to people who experience it and to kind of try to solve the problem, and try to solve the problem around the people who engage in these acts, we need to think about the bystanders. So, probably one of the biggest things that we need to think about in terms of, I think, tackling bystander, tackling racism and kind of discrimination type issues is about how do we behave as bystanders? Who are we as a community? What do you do when you see that person experiencing racism, like say when they're sitting on a bus on public transport, like someone else is yelling some racist abuse at them? What are ways that we can all behave as a group to actually support that person and stop the behavior without, harming ourselves? Because there's always a safety consideration. I ask people this question a lot, and often their thing is, of course, I will intervene if I feel safe. And it's absolutely justifiable that you would want to keep yourself safe and not put yourself in the line of fire. But if no one does anything, if you have one person sitting on a bus experiencing racism from another person and 20 people are sitting around them saying, I'm just not going to interfere, the person who's the subject of that racism is going to feel very lonely and isolated, and almost like all of those 20 other people sitting around them endorse the behavior, the bad behavior of the person who's perpetuating the racism around them, which is not who any of us want to be as a society. So we need to think about the skills and how we behave, and the strategies that we can use to actually give information to people, but think about these situations in advance ourselves about how would I respond if that happens. And then there's the other kind of forms of discrimination and bias that actually get in the way, which is the little things that chip away day by day. The bits that anyone who's experienced these things, in the workplace kind of go, well, how often in a meeting can I call out someone's language or their behavior or their, horribly racist or sexist jokes, when everyone's laughing? What are the ways I can actually, without being the person constantly called, what are ways we can do that? Like as a group, we could just sit and not laugh. Or you can use strategies like saying, I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean, getting the person to repeat it several times. These are all strategies that people talk about. But these things only happen when you think about how you might actually behave in those situations in a bit of a proactive way. So you kind of set yourself up as someone who is actually going to be an advocate and not just a bystander in this space, but an advocate in smart ways who kind of has a whole range of different ways to kind of flex and do these things. But I think we really need to accept, when you talk about fair go, that there are systemic barriers. Systemic barriers that come from unconscious bias that see our leaders as being basically white males. And, I'll just say that's not an entirely wrong decision if you think about, who is the president of the United States of America? A white male. And who's the likely alternative contender? A white male. And in a similar way, you think about who is the Prime Minister of Australia? A white male. And who is the opposition leader? A white male. So this shapes our psyche, our understanding of the world, that these are the people who are the leaders, and it cascades down into the workplace and into our communities, that we think these are the people with the labels who readily fit the notion of a leader, which means a woman of colour has to kind of almost collide up against that pre-understanding of who should be the leader in how they do those things. So it is, again, about how we see the world, understanding those things, thinking about it a lot. And I have hope that we can be the country of a fair go. For the most part, we are, but in many parts we are not. And it's kind of incumbent on all of us to actually do our best to kind of lift the fair go capability of our country.
You've mentioned like the bystander. I've got a friend who was on the train, and she's of Indian heritage, and she was racially attacked by a white woman. But then my friend, unfortunately, this woman picked on the wrong person, because my friend can stand up for herself. And my friend was responding to this woman to the point that the woman started crying and got off the train. And as soon as she got off the train, everyone in that carriage clapped for my friend and said, "Oh, well done for that." But they'd all been quiet. No one intervened. Everyone had been quiet. And my friend just got home and she cried and gave me a call. And, you're absolutely right about the bystander, and how when an incident like that happens and no one intervenes, it's extremely lonely.
It's a
Extremely
very
lonely.
lonely place. No, that's right. And your friend is, a strong woman, and everyone will say, well, she's okay. She seems to be all right to stand up for herself. So I don't need to put myself in that situation. But it's exhausting when you have to do that a lot. And I suspect she knew how to deal with it because it has happened to her before.
Yes.
And so then, therefore, she has thought about how will I respond when this happens to me next time. So that means she's had to do this multiple times. So, no one deserves to be in that lonely place, and no one needs to be, because a group of 20 can stand up with an individual against, one person. So we just need to be better as a community, I think, in doing that.
Be brave.
Absolutely, we need to be brave. That's exactly right.
Well, speaking of, we've spoken about the people in power. Do you think there's work needed? I mean, obviously there is, based on the discussion we've had so far, just to
Mm.
make Australia more inclusive. When I look at people that are, board members or people in senior leadership in politics or in corporate Australia, I don't see a lot of diversity there. What can we do? Like, what can we practically do to get a more diverse looking corporate leaders?
Yeah, yeah. So, and there's an interesting piece here around that. I've had a conversation around how do we get there, and is it just a matter of time that, as the numbers of diverse people in our community increase, it's just going to just then transition on so that the leadership will reflect that. I have to say outright, I don't think that is the case. We actually need to be more proactive in getting there. So if we look at, there's been research done by, I think, the Australian Human Rights Commission that says that, close to 95% of senior leaders in Australia are from Anglo-Celtic or European backgrounds. If you look at the top ASX 200 companies, in terms of that's, I think that 95 or 90% figure is in CEOs of the top 200 ASX companies are white Anglo-Celtic males. And women only make up about 22% of these positions. We've made some decent progress on women, and particularly women on boards. I think is much closer to almost a 50-50%. But even then, it's still probably women of colour are still very underrepresented in those figures. And that's reflected in my real life experience. So, I was in a very senior level within government, as a Deputy Director General. I'm now the CEO of an organisation. I am a woman of colour. So what I'll often say is that when I'm driving around, I'm going to go to a place for, a round table of CEOs or a gathering that has leadership stuff. I will stop at the traffic lights on the street if I'm driving to the space. I'll watch people walk in front of me in the city of Brisbane. And so every second or third person will be a person of a diverse ethnic background. And I can say, wow, I'm in a community that is very diverse, in a city that's very diverse. Park my car, go into that space, whether it's the boardroom or a gathering, and pretty much always find myself as the only woman of colour in that room. The more senior the gathering, the more likely it is that I will be the only person of colour. So I guess I'm proof that you can make it. It's not impossible, but certainly there are barriers around getting there. And it comes back to this notion of us understanding the labels that we put on people and how that in an unconscious way influences decisions around them being promoted, but also in an unconscious way, how as individuals it influences our thinking about, am I a leader? When am I going to be ready to apply for a role as a leader? But importantly, what I will often say to people when they say to me, what is a way that I can kind of develop myself to improve? I say, you've got to have the confidence in yourself. You've got to build your presence, and you've got to actually behave like a leader, even before you become a leader. But the reality is that we are still going to come up against biases. And something I'll share with you personally, I was speaking to someone recently out of in a bit of a coaching environment where they said to me, Christine, you don't have to do everything at 150%. 100% is enough. And then they went, why are you shaking your head at me? And I'm just going, I don't know, that's just who I am. I feel 100% is not enough. And I was speaking to the chair of my board about this conversation, and he said, well, that's probably partly you, but that's also partly a result of you having to go through your career as a woman of color and knowing that you had to do 150% to prove yourself, to prove that you were actually able to do a role that another person would only need to do at 80% or 70%. Because, particularly if they were a white male. And that's just the way the world is in terms of perceptions and biases, not because of facts, but because of the way people see the world. And that's the piece we've got to work to change. And if we have to do it slowly and incrementally, one step at a time, then so be it. But certainly, I don't believe that it is about just a matter of time that it will evolve naturally. We have to be proactively thinking about how we lift people up. How do we have those conversations? And how can we have this in a way that that people don't think that inclusion must mean exclusion of others? That way we always polarize into these separate spaces where someone says, well, but hang on, if you're going to be successful, that means I can't be because I don't look like you. Can we not just have a conversation about how we all need to be in the tent rather than saying, and we'll find ways to make it fit, rather than thinking, if I let you in the tent, then that means I've got to kick myself out of the tent, which actually is a very kind of more of a conflict-based piece. It's really about how do we all lift each other up going forward.
Oh, I love that. Like there's enough room for all of us, right?
Yes, absolutely.
And
Absolutely.
when you were talking about the 150%, I was nodding so hard because I was a senior leader in a Fortune 500 company, and one of the things that I found out quickly is I couldn't afford to make a single mistake.
Yes.
And I was the only woman of color. I was the first woman of color or a person of color they'd had on their senior leadership team. So I felt the pressure. But funny enough, though, it was never enough. It
Yeah.
was never enough. And, there would be mistakes other people would make, and that was permissible, but
Mm,
I was not allowed to make any mistakes. So at the end of the day, you really cannot be at 100%. And I know that's the ideal state, but in reality, 100% will get you out of the door very quickly. And it's unfortunate. It's
yes.
unfortunate, but it's the
Yeah.
reality most of us do face in these positions.
Yeah, and it comes from a whole upbringing that each individual framing of the world that each individual has experienced for their entire lifetime, right? So it embeds biases and understandings and expectations of others and of themselves. And the important bit here to tackle that is everyone needs to kind of surface their unconscious biases. And there's easy tools around there. There's the Harvard, bias implicit bias test that you can do. It's free online that just highlights how do you see the world, develop that awareness, and then think about ways that you can challenge that perception. And if everyone did that, then that means that everyone becomes a better person in terms of being able to tackle these issues and then work to lift others up as well as ourselves. So, and find ways to connect. I mean, a big part of the conversation, I think, a little bit unfortunate, but if it works, it works. It's around how do you lift women up in that space? And it's basically you speak to the men in leadership positions and say to them, think about your daughter to experience in this space. So you kind of personalize it in that sense and then extrapolate that to caring about others. So how do you find those points of connection and identification? But I really hope we can become a community and a society where we are wanting to lift others and include them, regardless of whether we have that direct, relatable, personal connection with them, even if they're fundamentally different, because we recognize that difference makes things better when we kind of deal with it well.
We will get there.
Yes, we will
We
get
have
there.
to. We have to.
Absolutely.
Christine, what are your thoughts on the Multicultural Framework Review that was initiated by the government a few months ago? And what impact, if any, do you think it will have if implemented effectively?
Yes, watch this space for the report, which will be coming out in March of 2024. But having been part of the panel of three people who kind of led the review, it was a phenomenal opportunity to have a conversation about multiculturalism in Australia going right across the country. So, I was lucky enough to kind of go have these conversations in Western Australia, Northern Territory, regional Queensland. We went cities as well as regional. We made sure we got out to talk to people from all sorts of different walks of life in the community sector, in schools. We even kind of planted ourselves in shopping centres to kind of do what we called um, park bench conversations. Just grabbed people to say, hey, do you want to talk to me about multiculturalism in Australia and where do you think it's going? And it was in a lot of ways a really positive, enriching kind of conversation that we had, because what surprised me was how people were really wanting to have that mature conversation about our national identity. Who are we as a country? Where do we want to go? And how do we come together to kind of make things better? And what are people grappling in trying to get with in terms of trying to get there, to kind of saying, I do find it a bit hard when I find myself at school with a bunch of kids, with parents who don't speak English. How do we navigate that? It's just so much harder. But wanting to do it in a way that comes with the best intent in the world. So there's a really mature conversation. People are ready for this. People are very open and embracing of different cultures and languages and difference, for the most part. But there was, of course, also the really heartbreaking stories of the racism that happens about those segments of people who are feeling excluded, and there are other people who are feeling threatened by the change and the difference. So people who say, I've been here for many years, my family came, 5, 6, 7, 8 generations ago and did it tough and established us, and I feel like I'm being displaced now. So recognizing the reality of that conversation. So coming through all of that was kind of, what do you do with all of this rich information in terms of putting some advice to government around how we can be better as a country? And it really comes down to recognizing that difference, really communicating that we are committed as a country, and that has to be from the highest level. The Prime Minister, the opposition leader need to affirm their commitment to multiculturalism as a thing, and that hasn't happened at a leadership level for a long time. A lot of these conversations have become bogged down in the minutiae of things like boat people, or are migrants stealing jobs, or what's going on with housing, whatever else. But let's just say we are who we are in terms of our diversity. We have people from a whole range of different backgrounds, which go back many different generations, and we're still grappling with that issue about embracing and how do we position our First Nations people within this country. That's a conversation that we still need to have. So there's all of these issues, but let's affirm and recognize, and let's just be really honest about the fact that we are a diverse country. If you look at the data, it says that nearly 50% of people who live in this country are migrants or children of migrants. Nearly 40% of people speak a language other than English at home. This is the Australian Bureau of Statistics data. So when we talk about multiculturalism, when we talk about cultural diversity, we're not talking about a minority. We're talking about the reality of who we are as a country. So let's embrace that and make the most that we can out of it. Now that translates into a whole bunch of things like, how do we recognize that we have many, many opportunities that we can tap into if we work to become a multilingual rather than a monolingual country? So certainly, English is our language of currency, and everyone needs to build that capability. But let's really foster languages in our schools, in our communities, support families to have their children grow up bilingual or multilingual. I thought we're really fortunate here at Multicultural Australia that we have, many of our staff who also have that refugee lived experience or migrant lived experience, who have lived in 3 or 4 different countries, come from countries which are multilingual, and some of them speak 11 languages, 8 languages. There's a general rule, 4 languages. That's just an amazing capability. And imagine as a country, if we had this language capability, how much stronger we would be in terms of tourism, in terms of global trade, in terms of our economic productivity, lifting our capability as a country. So recognizing that full potential of language, but also using that potential then as well to make sure people get access to the services they need. In terms of the language services, translator, interpreter services are a big piece. And in terms of then what we think about how we create the setting so people actually feel that they belong. So our young people don't feel that they kind of have to straddle several worlds and navigate through, do you belong to this country because your color of your skin is different from who we think should belong in this country, which can then impact on mental health and well-being. So if you think about language, if you think about services, you think about the country you want to be, the spaces we create, and how we think about people who live in this country, in the regions, in the cities, regardless of your age, what are the settings that we need to think about to actually make this a truly successful multicultural country?
I love that, because again, there's enough room for all of us, isn't there?
Yes, absolutely right. So, yeah. And, there's the Scanlon Foundation Social Cohesion Report that came out really recently. That's a very extensive survey report that came out, I think, late last year, which said pretty much the majority of Australians do support migration. It is the social cohesion dimensions that they're less confident about. It's the connection pieces. So that says that there's something that we've got to work on. But in general, that people do actually are open to migration and recognizing that migration is what this country needs. The only way we're going to reverse the negative population growth trend that Australia is experiencing is migration. So it's a necessity. It's where we're going.
So, what are some of the, like you are CEO of Multicultural Australia. What are some of the obstacles or setbacks that you've encountered, and how did you overcome them? What did you learn from those experiences?
Mm. I think we've talked a little bit about how you do have to work harder to prove yourself. So so I wouldn't say like major setbacks, but I mean this constant thing which can sometimes be, I mean it requires extra energy for you to do that, so it's quite exhausting. So certainly that piece around having to work harder than others, but the other piece as well is around labels. So you always have to get around the label. And the thing is that we all put labels on others. You categorize a person. Your brain needs to do the shortcuts to kind of, try to work through who is this person in front of me? What are the immediate kind of cognitive labels I'm going to put, and them inform their understanding. And so certain types of individuals, in my case, a woman of color, get certain labels which are not attributed to a male, who is from a different label, who will have different labels attached. If they're kind of Anglo background, if they're of a certain age, your age kind of also informs things. And I have to say, quite honestly, as I, kind of get into the whole middle age trajectory, I kind of experience that piece as well about it can quite easily kind of be kind of dismissed. There's an invisibility to middle-aged women that actually does apply, that becomes very, very apparent. I like to play with those labels a bit. Sometimes I will deliberately dress myself down and walk into a shop that I would otherwise walk into in my work clothes, just to watch reactions from people, staff, whatever else, and you get a very, very clear kind of differences in terms of reactions. And it's a really good reminder about how who you are is very much framed by the persona that you construct and present to the world. So it's something that kind of everyone should do to kind of just remind themselves of, this is what I would be up against, but for what I've learned to put in place. My wardrobe, the way I present myself, the way I walk, and if I can change that quite in a visible way, I can see how that becomes an obstacle, because there are obstacles that I've learned to overcome during the course of my life and during the course of my career. But it is about, those things around, I think it's been an interesting journey of going and working in a kind of a non-multicultural, like the more monocultural kind of space, and working in a whole range of different areas, and then coming back into the multicultural space, where I realized how much of my culture I had to keep kind of invisible in certain spaces to be accepted, versus around here. And it sounds like really, I suppose, trite things, but it's things like where people who come to Multicultural Australia, because we've got over 86 different nationalities, will talk about, it's just so great that I can just have whatever I like for lunch without people making a comment about the smell of my food.
Yeah.
And it just makes a difference in terms of a person's sense of belonging. I don't feel like I have to, if I'm answering a phone call from a family member or a friend and I'm going to speak in my language, I don't feel like I have to duck into a separate room so that everyone doesn't feel threatened by that. These are the obstacles, I think, that people from a diverse cultural background, diverse language background will often face. And there's some of the kind of the parts of the things, the stories that I've realized, wow, yeah, I did put up with all of that. I kind of worked my way through it. And that was part and parcel of the life, that I led. I wouldn't say it traumatized me, but certainly there were barriers and obstacles and things that had to be overcome.
What would be some of the like actionable advice or tips to for fellow migrants who want to be in leadership positions or who just really want to have a good life in Australia?
Yeah. I think the first thing I always say this is seize opportunities. So seize the chances that present themselves to you, even though it might not look tremendously exciting or not be aligned with your one goal. So my strong advice to people often is it's good to have a goal, but don't lock in. Because when you lock in really hard onto a goal, you deny yourself other opportunities sometimes that present themselves because you're blind to them. And the thing is about trying to think through about, if I can just spend a bit of time in this space and get this experience, how can I then broaden it out to kind of then get me to where I want to go to? So that's a really, really important piece about, you know, develop the right mindset that's there for you. Now, if you actually have a dream and a goal and you want to pursue it, of course you should pursue it. But, just keep an eye out around what else is going on around you that might help you get there, even if it's a little diversion. And sometimes those diversions actually send you down a path that you actually discover will adjust your role or dream, will actually send you off in a different direction. And that's not a bad thing. But the thing is as well about, look, the reality of succeeding in leadership, it's about networks and connections and the people that you know. Now, I'm not, obviously you want to get to where you get on merit, but you do need to know. The question is not who you know, it's actually who knows you and how do they know you? What do they think of you? And that comes down to how you present yourself with a degree of confidence as the person who actually would fit into that position that you want to be in. But that's not for you to decide that you're fit to be in that position. It's for others. So you've got to think about, how do you present to others? How do they see you? Do they know you? Have they heard of you? If they met you, would they see you in that position? And so how do you position yourself for that? And the way you do that is you talk to people, you seek advice. And then the final thing I'll just say is to always be open to learning. You are never going to be exactly where you are. Plus, learning keeps life really interesting because you get to think about things and things don't get stale. But also be a person of reflection. And so that you also want to think about where you are, what are your circumstances, how do you adapt? This is where your chameleon power comes into play. This is your superpower as a migrant, that you know how to get yourself right for the setting, because that's what you've been doing the whole time you've been here. So tap into that as your secret superpower.
I love that. What motivates you to keep pushing forward, in face of challenges? What keeps you inspired and what keeps you empowered to continue your journey?
Look, I'm an optimist, and I know sometimes optimists can be very exhausting just because of their perennial belief in how, good things will come from everything. But, that's really kind of, that mindset has very much helped me. It's something that comes to me kind of quite naturally. But I'm also very pragmatic and practical about things. So it is about just when, I don't blindly believe in a thing and just hope it'll happen. It's about, I'm also a very practical person who thinks about, well, how do we get there? And if we can't get there today, then what little bits can we do now to get us to where we can get to? So, it is about, I think, just believing in the cause that you're there to do. So Multicultural Australia, as the CEO of Multicultural Australia, it is just, I just feel incredibly privileged and lucky to have this role and to work with the people I work with, both inside the organisation and in the communities, and even just kind of being able to introduce the richness of what we do in multicultural world to other people who don't experience it. Because when you see there's this real joy in how we celebrate our food, we celebrate our festivals, and sometimes we get people who come from very very, very challenging backgrounds, like coming from war-torn areas, but at that point that they hear the music, of, their country, or that they connect with, the joy that comes through, it's something that, I really hope is infectious. You want to make it infectious because you want everyone to be able to be a part of that. And that is because that's the human condition, how you make the human condition better. So it is really about being able to make that difference. And what I often find inspires me most are the people who do amazing things, who often just don't have very much, but also who kind of keep going and who are able to find that joy in life despite everything that life has thrown at them, because they actually have that full-blown appreciation for, how good it is to basically be alive. So that human condition, I think, is, I just see so much of it around me every day in this work, and that's really kind of what keeps me going. And when you see people going, it gives you perspective as well, in terms of just being able to rise above the smaller things in your life that sometimes seem so annoying, but you realize are just not that important. So, yeah.
Oh, Christine, this conversation has been incredibly empowering and inspiring. Thank you so much for being a part of Empowered Voices Amplified. I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule. I know, because like I said, I follow you closely on LinkedIn. So So I know how busy you've been in the past few months. So if people want to connect with you or get involved, what's the
Yeah.
best place for them to?
Absolutely. Well, as you said, I'm on LinkedIn, so people want to connect me with me, I'm right there. But also, Multicultural Australia has an excellent website. We've just relaunched and redesigned that website where it identifies where people want to volunteer or want to engage, or even just know about the many events that we do in community. We always love to have more people come on board to kind of join us on our cause in terms of going forward on the journey. So those would probably be the best ways to connect. But thank you so much for the chance to have this conversation. It's always great to, take that time out to actually think about things that you don't actually think about as you race through life. So it's been really lovely to have this conversation with you.
Oh, well, thank you again. And thank you to our listeners for tuning in to the latest episode of Empowered Voices Amplified. We'll see you next time.
Excellent.